Minnesota is home to 11,842 lakes and 6,564 natural streams and rivers. Our waters flow north to Hudson Bay, east to the Atlantic Ocean, and south to the Gulf of Mexico. We fish in these waters, swim in them, drift down them on lazy summer afternoons, trailing coolers behind us. From chasing frogs through small creeks as children, to dropping lines through the ice for a little alone time, we spend a lot of time in and around the water. This is Min Central Currents. I'm your host, Teresa Meese. This Earth Day, we're asking, what's the quality of our lakes and rivers in central Minnesota? And what can we do to ensure we have safe water to enjoy for generations to come? My first guest, Dave Rieder, has spent most of his life living near the Crow River in Delano.
I know the Crow River. I've lived the Crow River. I'm a Tom Sawyer type where I used to hang out there when you could be, 9 years old and make rafts and float down the river, and your mom and dad won't even know it. That's the kind of stuff I did when I was a kid. And the Crow River, it's always changing year to year. It sometimes gets wider, sometimes gets narrower, but it's moving water and it's always going someplace. And then no matter how many times you go down there, there's always something new, especially if you know the river really well, like I do. Because we used to use the river as a playground, I've noticed over the years that it's way, way different than when I was a kid. It's probably cleaned up a lot more as far as people don't go up and just find a ravine going into the river and dump all their trash. And, that's what they did in the old days. Everybody used it as a dump. And you don't see too much of that anymore. But you see things like the river isn't any cleaner than it used to be. You think it would be what everybody's kind of getting the idea of, that you just can't keep throwing stuff in the river. But in a way, I think it's actually dirtier than it used to be. The river never has been where you want to go down there and just drink it. It's not like the early pre-settler days where in Delano, I've known the history and I'm always interested in the river when it was clean and deep before pre-settler days. And there's history of that. Steamboats used to come all the way up the Mississippi, all the way up the Crow River, and basically the stop-off point was at one time right in front of Main Street, Delano, Dave's Town Club. And now it's so filled in and so shallow that you're lucky if you can do that with a canoe in the summer, where they used to do with steamboats. So if you look at it as a whole overall picture, I think the river has basically silted in and got shallower. And when I was a kid, I could walk maybe 2 minutes from my house where I'm sitting right now, and there'd be 1,000 wood ducks on the river. And that's because there is more vegetation, more swampland, more estuaries and marshy type areas, but it's the same thing that's happening all over because the river is getting filled in and these swamps are getting drained. What you see is a river when the water's in it, like in the spring, you'll see more flooding and erosion and things like that. But I'd love to go back 200 years ago and see what the river actually looked like, because that would be a pretty amazing thing. I've got an uncle that died a few years ago. He lived to be 102, and before he died, I took him with my new truck and gave him a ride on these gravel roads where I live, and he was pointing out trout streams that he used to fish trout when he was a kid. And now they're basically just farm runoff going straight into the river. And I said, that would have really been cool to be back in those days. And it'd be a whole different world. I kind of wish we could get it back like that. I could write books on my childhood down the river. And there was a lot more wildlife around the river, especially ducks, because there was more nesting areas. There's more grass. There was more little side overflows with spring floods, and that would take a couple months to dry up. My brother and I, we took a canoe down from Lake Itasca to Big Sandy Lake, and that's the Mississippi River. And we paddled 50 miles a day downstream, and we found out what the river can do on its own if we just give it a chance. And we found out these huge swamps that people consider wastelands, they're like nature sponges. The river would go in cloudy because there is erosion whether we're creating it or not. It'd go in real cloudy and dark. And when we came out of these huge swamps that were as far as the eye can see, you could swear you could drink the water. It was so clear. So that was nature doing what it's supposed to do on its own with no help from us. And I thought that was pretty cool. And then the whole process would start over again, and we'd go 50 miles and we run into another swamp and they do the same thing. And it tells you right there, instead of draining the swamps, we should be creating it, slowing it down. And nature will do a lot even on its own, but we have to realize one thing. We have to kind of look at the source of the problem, which is mostly caused by us, and we have to just let nature do what it's supposed to do.
I'd like to thank Dave for sharing his perspective from a lifetime spent along the Crow River. If you'd like to see the incredible music venue that he and his family have created in Delano, you can find them by searching Facebook for Rieder Homestead Concerts. That's spelled R-I-E-D-E-R. My next guest is John Barton of the Clean Water Council, where he is chair of the policy committee. When we spoke, I just jumped right in and asked him what led him to be passionate about clean water.
Oh, that's, I don't know that anything led me there. It's always been a passion of mine from when I was little. I lived in a real small town up in Stearns County, and there was a creek that ran maybe a quarter of a mile behind my house. And I just loved going down to that creek and building little dams with stones and watching the fish swim by and that sort of thing. So running water in particular has always been a fascination for me. And then, of course, when I got to college and I studied limnology, basically, that's inland fresh water. So I got degrees in both chemistry and biology because I was interested in both facets of it. And I worked for a couple of years with a soil and water conservation district trying to improve water quality this was in the Stearns County area. And then I went back to college and got a master's degree in aquatic biology. And that's when I fell in love with lakes. So I worked pretty much my entire career dealing with either lakes or streams. And I worked for Three Rivers Park District. And of course, Three Rivers Park District had two major parks, Lake Rebecca Park Reserve and Crow-Hassan Park Reserve, right on the Crow River itself. So in that context, I got involved in some of the early planning for the improvements and management of the Crow River itself. And one of the things that really led me to really I wouldn't say focus exclusively on the Crow River, but be very interested in the Crow River is one of my responsibilities is to deal with old abandoned wells throughout the Park District. The Park District bought most of their land. It was old farmsteads. So I was charged with inventorying those farm sites, finding those abandoned wells or finding those unused wells, and then having a contractor come in and abandoning them correctly. In the process of doing that, myself and one of my colleagues were out at Crow-Hassan Park Reserve one day and looking around behind the foundation of the house and the barn, and we found a pile. It was just an odd looking pile, about 3 feet high, maybe 10, 12 feet in diameter. And just for whatever reason, we gave it a kick, and it turned out to be mussel shells or clam shells. So it was a huge pile of clam shells. And then, as luck would have it, as we were leaving the site, 2 gentlemen came walking up. So we started talking to them, wondering what they were looking at. And one of them indicated that he lived on that place as a little boy. So a great opportunity to find out, well, how did all those clam shells get there? They used to have clam bakes. They'd go out in the river, pull the clams out, and then have clam bakes. Well, if you look at the Crow River today and you look at some of the water quality issues, the clam or the mussel population, more technically, is such that clams don't really grow very well in the Crow River anymore. So I looked at that juxtaposition of what the Crow River used to be and what it is today, and I thought, well, why can't we return it to what it was? So that kind of led me into looking a little more at the river system and what was causing the impacts. And it turned out, coincidentally again, that the planning for the Crow River management was starting about that time. And I was designated the Park District representative on those early efforts. So that's kind of what got me involved in the Crow River itself. The water quality itself, I've always been very interested in and passionate about, and I made it my career. Although, admittedly, I focused more on lakes than rivers through most of my career. But nevertheless, since all lakes drain into rivers and most rivers flow into lakes, the two are always interconnected.
So how would you say we're doing with our water quality management over the last 20 to 30 years? Is it getting better, getting worse?
I think in terms of lakes, it's lakes per se. That is a question that is totally dependent upon individual lakes and what management activities are occurring in those lakes. Some of the lakes that the Park District has property on, for instance, Medicine Lake, Bryant Lake, which is in Eden Prairie, and Medicine Lake is in Plymouth, Fish Lake and Maple Grove. We took very concerted efforts to try to improve those quality because the Park District has swimming beaches on them. And by and large, we were very successful. Some of the more rural lakes that are more affected or impacted by agricultural runoff have either not changed much in quality over the last 20, 30 years or have gotten worse. And rivers, by and large, have gotten, I would say, significantly worse, especially in terms of some of the pollutants, nitrates being one of them. So nitrates and sediment load in those rivers. So the rivers in Minnesota tend to be more turbid than what they used to be. And that's both a function of land use changes and climate change. The lakes are improving because climate has probably not affected the lake quality as much as it has affected river quality.
Can you tell me more about how climate change is affecting the river quality?
It's affected river quality because our precipitation patterns have changed. So we're getting more high volume rain events. We get a lot more precip at one time than what we used to get. Combined with a shift in the agricultural community to more row crop agriculture and away from alfalfa and small grains, which tend to provide more cover over the soil. So you got more sediment flowing into the river. And then because you got more water in the river has to change in order to accommodate that flow. So if you think of a river as a pipe, okay, we've got, let's say for the sake of argument, a 20-inch pipe that used to carry the Crow River flow. Now we've got 25 inches of water in that 20-inch pipe. Well, obviously the pipe can't carry it, and neither can the rivers anymore. So the rivers are changing. The way rivers change to accommodate increased flow is the water has to run faster, which erodes the bottom, and then they call it's called incising. So basically the river becomes deeper. Well, if you think of a river becoming deeper, then what happens to the banks? They get steeper along the sides and start to fall in. So there's more sediment going into the river system itself. And it turns out in the Crow River, the studies have shown that about 60% of the sediment in the river is coming from bank erosion. And again, that's caused by this increase in precipitation, partly from the climate change and then partly from agricultural drainage. About 45% of the cropland in the Crow River system is tile drained currently. So that runs more water into the river in combination with the increased precipitation. So you get a lot more water that the river has to handle, and the river is changing to accommodate that flow.
Since we're talking about the agricultural impact on our rivers, I know that in Minnesota there's been an effort to create buffer zones around fields. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes. About 5 years ago, the legislature passed a buffer ordinance, which required on all public waters that there had to be a buffer, and the buffer width varied from 16.5 feet up to about 30 feet along all public ditches and streams and rivers and lakes also in agricultural areas. So as the water is running toward those drainage ditches and toward the streams and the rivers and the lakes, it gets filtered through the buffer. And the buffer simply means it's an area of natural growth that's not tilled and it's not plowed or whatever, and it's not planted to row crops. It's planted to permanent vegetative cover like grasses and trees and shrubs and that sort of thing. So yes, that's probably going to help in the long term, but it just takes a while for those things to happen. The majority of the buffers in Minnesota that are required have already been installed, but only in about the last 2 to 3 years. So it's going to take a while for us to really see the effectiveness of those buffers on a statewide or a watershed-wide basis.
It's important to note that average citizens are also responsible for the care and upkeep of our rivers. So could you talk a little bit about what impact we have on the water quality and what we can change to make things better?
There are a lot of things we're doing, but let me pick on probably the two most problematic right now. One is nitrogen. You've probably heard of the dead zone off the Gulf of Mexico. Yes, from the Mississippi River. So that's the result of too much nitrogen flowing into the Crow River and then flowing into the Mississippi River and ultimately into the Gulf of Mexico. Obviously, a lot of that is agriculture because the majority of the land in Minnesota is agricultural production. Nevertheless, we have quite a bit of urban area in the Crow River watershed. You've got, Delano and Watertown and Hutchinson and Litchfield and Paynesville and a number of other cities. And when cities build, of course, you put in streets, you put in houses, and all of that is called impervious surface area, the rooftops, the streets, and that increases the runoff dramatically. People also like really nice, lush green lawns. And to have those lush green lawns, you need nitrogen. Too many people, I wouldn't say all, but a lot of people have the attitude that if a little is good, more is better. So we tend to over-fertilize our lawns with nitrogen. So for the average citizen, looking at how much nitrogen they're applying to their lawn and when they're applying it and how they're applying it is critical in terms of trying to improve the quality of not just the Crow River, but also the Mississippi and then the anoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So I would say nitrogen is one. Second one is chloride. Chloride is basically just salt. We use an awful lot of salt in Minnesota, in particular, on our roads in the wintertime because people want to drive fast and they want their streets clear and they don't want any ice on them. And that's all very understandable. So we tend to add a lot of salt to our streets, which of course flows in the river.
How hard is it to remove nitrogen and chloride from the water system?
You can eliminate nitrogen from the system through a chemical process called denitrification, which basically converts nitrates and nitrites into atmospheric nitrogen. Then it's up in the air and it really doesn't cause any problem. Salt, unfortunately, doesn't do that. If you put salt in water, it is there forever. It never goes away. It really doesn't change composition at all. It's always just sodium chloride, and it's just salt. So we discharge salt to the Crow River in particular in two different ways. One is the road salt that we put on, keep our roads safe. The other one is through water softeners. So you can treat nitrates in water in a wastewater treatment plant and phosphorus and remove it. You really can't do that with salt efficiently. So when people use water softeners, especially inefficient water softeners, all of that salt goes into the wastewater system, into the wastewater treatment plant, and again, just gets discharged into the river. So the Crow River, in fact, is impaired in certain stretches for chloride. In other words, there's just too much chloride in it. And across the state, there are a number of municipalities that have to take specific action, either build a addition to their wastewater treatment plant, a very expensive system. Basically, it's a reverse osmosis, which some people have in their homes, right? But on a large scale, to remove salt from their wastewater treatment plant effluent in order to protect the downstream water quality because it's impaired for chloride. Now, we really don't want to go down that road in the communities along the Crow River because that's really, really expensive. So there's a easy way for homeowners to try and reduce the amount of chloride coming from their water softeners, and that is to get an efficient water softener that operates on a on-demand instead of a timing basis. So an on-demand system says when your water hardness reaches a certain point, then the system recharges itself. And if it doesn't, if you're gone for 2 weeks on vacation, we used to take vacations like this before COVID, then the system won't charge at all. Where a time system, if you set it every 3 days, whether you're there using water or not, every 3 days it's discharging salt into the system. So that's one way. And in fact, I put in one of those high efficient systems, an on-demand system myself. And my own experience, and this may not be true for everybody, I went from about, I was probably using 60 pounds of salt per month to using about 120 pounds per year. So I had a reduction of well over 70% in terms of how much salt I was using in my system. Now, not only is that good for the environment, good for the river, it's also good for my pocketbook. The system costs more initially, but I'm probably saving $130, $150 or more per year on it. So over a 20-year lifespan of this system, I'm going to more than get my money back.
Do you know if any of the municipalities that are required to reduce their salt content are offering rebates for their citizens to upgrade to one of these on-demand softeners?
Yes. A number of the cities that I mentioned that have these chloride limitations in their wastewater, before they look at the multi-million-dollar treatment system at their wastewater treatment plant, they're going back into the community, working with their citizens to try to implement these things on a citywide basis.
We can hardly talk about the Crow River without addressing its propensity for flooding. Do you know if there is any way for a community to mitigate flooding in their region without causing issues in the communities downstream?
Oh, now that's the million-dollar question. Can you minimize flooding in your community and not affect the people downstream? And the answer is unfortunately, no, you cannot. Unless you're mitigating your flooding by storing that water and allowing it to spread out over the floodplain. Unfortunately, most communities along the rivers, whether it be the Crow River and Delano, whether it be St. Cloud and the Mississippi River, or the Sauk River, which also runs through the northern part of St. Cloud, we have built in the floodplain, and we no longer have the option of allowing the river to spread out. So our options are somewhat limited. What the Crow River plan, and not just the Crow River, but many of the other systems, agricultural drainages like the Sauk River, and a number of the plans for the rivers down, the Redwood River, Yellow River down in the Mankato area, all have kind of a common theme, and that is we have to store more water on the land, on the agricultural land. Now that's a tough thing to do because to build a pond to store the water so it doesn't flow into the rivers as fast, and you reduce those flood flows or the peak flows, they're typically called. It takes land to do that. Nevertheless, the only way we can really resolve this problem is by doing that. One of the ways that we found is most efficient is to simply restore some of the drained wetlands. So historically, a lot of our land in Minnesota was wetland, and I think it was around 15 million acres. Most of those are drained now for agricultural production, which makes our food cheap, but it causes other problems, obviously, if you live along a river. So we need to restore some of those. In other areas, putting a temporary detention pond at the outlet of a ditch where it flows into a river or a stream is a more efficient way to do it because it takes less space. You can have the water deeper, typically, than a wetland. So it takes less. You can hold as many gallons, but the water gets deeper and it doesn't spread out over the land as much. The other thing that was probably more efficient is simply to get the soil healthy enough so that it stores the rainfall water and it doesn't run off. And there's a big concerted effort across the state, a lot of work being done by the University of Minnesota, Department of Agriculture, and other groups to try to do that. It's really what they call their soil health initiative. So you hear that buzzword a lot right now, is increasing or improving soil health. What it really boils down to is increasing the organic matter in the soil, not just at the top couple of inches, but maybe down 6 inches to a foot, increasing the organic matter, which stores water. So if you think of the Crow River Basin, the management plan for the Crow River Basin says that we need to store an additional 0.75 inches over the almost 1 million acres of the North Fork of the Crow River, and then the South Fork of the Crow River is another 800,000 acres. So that's about 104,000 acre feet. So that's 104,000 acres, a foot deep of water. That's a lot of water. So if we can get the soil healthy enough to store some of that for us, you don't have to take land out of production. It benefits the farmers by having more land, or simply more water in the soil profile. So instead of having it run off and causing downstream problems, eroding your fields, etc., carrying the fertilizer off, you're storing it in the soil.
So how do we make our soil healthier?
There's a couple of techniques that people are using to do that. There's cover crops, which if you think your ordinary cornfield, you plant the corn, so it's bare in the spring. You plant your corn. When you harvest in the fall, it gets plowed up, and half of the year, the soil is completely bare. Well, there's nothing to slow the runoff water down. So you get a lot of runoff from those areas. What cover crops do is you would plant them sometime during the growing season in between the corn rows. So when you harvest the corn, you've got something growing between the rows. And that something could be, I've actually seen in North Dakota, radishes and turnips. And then they let their cattle feed on those radish tops and the turnip tops in the fall after the corn was harvested. And there are a number of other plants that people are trying and the University of Minnesota is working on.
So there is a clear need to improve our water quality, and there are avenues that you've discussed with us today on how to do that. How do we get people engaged in this effort?
Not everybody can be a nerd about water quality like probably you and I are. They're involved in, whatever their interests are. And I don't understand anything about financing and investing, so I let my financial people do that. I don't care about it. I have no interest in it. And other people are the same way with water quality. I understand that. So it's a question of how we reach out to those folks and how you can approach them so that they know what the right thing to do is. And we make it easy for them. And that's the key.
Thank you for joining me so we could help our listeners get a better handle on what's happening in the world of water quality and what they can do to help with it. Are there any closing thoughts that you'd like to leave us with today?
I would only say that just kind of an overall overarching thought is that the Crow River has a lot of problems, as do most other rivers in Minnesota, the Mississippi included. They're impaired for numerous pollutants like bacteria and nitrates and chloride and sediment and dissolved oxygen, which is significant impacting the fish populations in those rivers, as well as the invertebrate population like the clams and the snails and that sort of thing. And so we need to take a holistic look at it, and your average citizen needs to be aware of all of these things at some level. And I guess so simply to be aware of that there are a lot of impairments, a lot of pollutants that are going into the rivers and lakes as well, that are not only bad for the river, but they're bad for us. And when we talked earlier about the flood flows in the Crow River and in the Mississippi River and everywhere else, that's not just a problem for the river, it's a problem for us. Now, I live in Delano, and at the south end of our community, we have what's called River Street for obvious reasons. It runs right along the Crow River. And just before this River Street crosses under Highway 12, so it crosses on Highway 12, last year and a half, the city had to put in a stream stabilization structure. So basically sheet pilings right on the riverbank to keep the road from eroding away. Well, that was hundreds of thousands of dollars. About a quarter mile north of the city, the Crow River runs adjacent to a county road. And the county has funded 2 stream stabilization projects in the last 10 years in order to protect their road from being washed away and undermined. And that was over $1 million for those projects. So this is a huge burden for the taxpayers if we don't go in and manage our rivers and streams appropriately. So it's not just an environmental problem, it's an economic problem, because nobody wants to go out and pay taxes. But you either have to move the road, which costs millions of dollars, or you have to stabilize the river, which costs millions of dollars. So either way, you have to pay millions of dollars. So, and I hope that ultimately, in my view, is what is going to generate the interest in correcting some of these problems. It's just too expensive not to.
Thanks again to John Barton. The Clean Water Council meets every 3rd Monday of the month. Sorry, you just missed their April meeting on the 19th. But the meetings are open to the public and are currently being held online. Check our show notes for the link. We've made our podcast more accessible. We're now on YouTube, where community members have access to closed captioning. Once we get to 100 YouTube subscribers, we qualify for a fancy custom URL. But in the meantime, search YouTube for Min Central Currents. And I'm not of the right generation to use words like hit or smash, but I can say click subscribe. The link will also be in our show notes. Be sure to pass it along to anyone who you know could use it. This episode was developed and managed by Renee Cardarell. Production by me, Teresa Meese. Music provided by Epidemic Sound. Contact us with your questions and comments at Min Central Currents, that's MINN, Central Currents with an S, at gmail.com. Our Twitter handle is @MinCentral, and you can find us on your favorite podcast app at Min Central Currents. Don't forget to click subscribe, and we'll see you next week.